Hey everybody, it's me, Tara. I'm the lead pastor here at Northpoint Vineyard Church, and I'm glad you guys are watching with us today. We have our next message in our Unconquerable Kingdom message series, but first, I'll give you a little bit of an idea about what's up here at Northpoint. Here at Northpoint, we are gearing up and getting ready for fall. We were preparing and planning for this next season of ministry, and I have to say, we're excited. 3 things are happening that I want you to keep on your radar. We'll be starting a new message series in September that will walk us through most of the fall. We're going to be talking about leaning in and listening to the voice of God and living lives led by the voice of God. I'm really excited about the potential for this message series, so I hope that you plug in, not just on Sunday mornings, but also to the other stuff that's happening in our community this fall. We're also planning a new set of small groups. If you are interested in participating in or leading a small group, I want you to let me know. We're going to spend the next few weeks trying to connect people into groups. We know how vital it is as we walk with Jesus to do this together and in a community. So please think about a way that you can fit participating in a small group into your life schedule. It's so vital, and we'll have more information about that soon. And on top of those things, we're also planning just a few fun family events. We'll have another worship bonfire. We're going to try to make a trip to Thistleberry Farms. We're putting together a ladies' night later in the fall. We're excited to be able to connect with each other this upcoming season. So stay posted for more information about all of that. You'll be able to find that information on our website, or if you follow us on Facebook, you'll see it right here. So keep posted and we'll let you know. Another reminder, church, that we are so grateful and so thankful for your financial faithfulness in the way that it makes all of this ministry happen. Thank you. So here is your regular reminder about tithes and offerings as a way to honor Jesus with your life. You guys can give online through our Church Center app, send a check in the mail, or drop one off the next time you're here on site at Northpoint. And with that, we'll transition and get ready for today's message. Today's message is an important one, so I'm glad that you guys are listening. We're going to be talking about unity and disunity in the body of Christ. We've been looking at the early church in the book of Acts, and what we'll see is that there's something really powerful about the church when it's moving forward with one mind and one mission, united through the Spirit. But as we'll soon see, as we read the story of the early church, that's not always the story. We see these snippets of a church that's marked by dissension and disagreement and stress and strife. And what we're going to learn is that unity is a powerful and vital force in the kingdom. And it is as much now as it was then. And we each have a role in cultivating that community in the parts of the kingdom that we occupy. So what I'd like you to do to start today is to think about a time in your life when you've experienced unity, when you've experienced a sense of peace and oneness in community. Now, I'm a mom with 3 little girls, which means that I often see and experience disunity. I mean, we haven't even made it to the teen years, but I will say that we have like the pre-teen drama queen stuff down pat. It's hard to go more than 20 minutes in my household without hearing some kind of outburst or someone bursting in to tears. Often I will walk into a room when I hear the volume has risen to a certain level and needs obvious intervention. And what I often see is everyone talking at once and everyone talking over someone else. The youngest kid is crying. The oldest one is giving me a very detailed tattletale report. The middle one is denying any kind of wrongdoing whatsoever. At least someone is yelling or someone is crying. Exasperated, my response is like, why is everybody so loud? And why is everybody so mean? But sometimes, and parents, you know this, sometimes I can walk into a room and hear nothing but soft, sweet giggles, or look out across the backyard and see them playing together, like in the same activity, like sharing and being kind. Like you can picture those moments, right? When your children are being kind and quiet, those are magical moments, aren't they? Even if they are few and far between. Unity is a powerful experience. Maybe you've experienced it in a different setting. Maybe you've experienced it at work, where you have full agreement or on a project or a goal, or you see people supporting each other as you're moving towards the mission in front of you. There's a sense of cooperation, and we're on the same pageness. We can even experience unity in that kind of setting. Maybe you've experienced unity in the body of Christ. And if you have, I tell you, then you have experienced something special. A few years ago, a group of leaders here at Northpoint started meeting regularly to pray and to assess and to dream about the future of ministry here for our church. We had just walked through a major leadership transition, and we were reworking our vision statement, our values, our mission, our goals. And what we would do is we would get together and we would throw like 100 words up on a whiteboard, and we'd try to connect them and put them into sentences that could describe the kind of church we felt called to be, the kind of church that we wanted to see. And I'm going to tell you, like, those meetings weren't always easy. We had a bunch of opinionated people in one room with different perspectives and different experiences. And we were wrestling with words and nuance, and that's not easy stuff. And we were pushing and pulling because we wanted to get it right. But there was this sense of unity in the process. There was this sense that we were together on this mission. We were moving forward in the same direction. We had the same hopes. It's like we had the same heart. It was beautiful. It was beautiful. So maybe you've experienced that before in like the body of Christ church setting, maybe in a small group prayer circle, when you could like, your hearts were broken about the same issue and you were bringing it to Jesus. Or maybe on a Sunday morning during a worship service when we're all singing the same song and you just know, that the same spirit that's in the room is the same spirit that's in each and every one singing. Like, those are beautiful. Kingdom come, your will be done moments. That's what the beauty of unity can be. So this idea of unity in the body of Christ is something that we find all over the book of Acts. About 15 times there are phrases about being of one heart or one mind or on the same pageness in the book of Acts. We see the first one in Acts chapter 1, verse 14. It says, they all met together and were constantly united in prayer. There's this sense that these people were doing this thing and they were doing it with the same heart and in the same spirit. And then in Acts chapter 2, when all of the believers are gathered together, that's when the Holy Spirit came, right? And they all had tongues of fire on their foreheads, and they all spoke in different languages, even each other's language. It was this beautiful moment of unity. And then we read about how they pooled all of their possessions together to care for each other's needs. This is the picture of unity that we see in the early pages in the book of Acts, and it kind of carries this ideal, like, utopic idea with it, doesn't it? But let me tell you, that was not always the case by a mile. If you get more than a few chapters into a book of Acts, which a lot of us don't do because it's a really long book, let's be honest. If you get more than a few chapters into the book of Acts, you're going to see that the unity of the early church is constantly under threat of disunity, and from every which way you can imagine. So let's get to it and look back at the book. Now, if you watched last week, which was your homework because we didn't have service, we were serving at Rebel Art Fest, but if you watched last week, you'll remember that we looked some at the character of Saul/Paul, right? And I want to repeat and reiterate something that we hit last week because it's going to be really helpful in our discussion on unity today. So remember that when we first met Paul, he was this staunch opponent of the Jesus movement. But what we tried to do last week was to pause and look at the motivations of this guy's heart, because we do have some hints. And what we see is that in his heart, Paul was a zealous proponent of God. When he stands over the stoning of Stephen, or when he demands papers so that he can go and capture men and women who are following the Jesus movement, you need to know that Paul thought in his heart that he was doing all of this for the sanctity and glory of God. We looked at, last week, we looked at his own self-description from the book of Philippians. Let's look at that today. Philippians 3:4. If anyone else thinks they have reasons to put such confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews. In regard to the law, a Pharisee, as for zeal, persecuting the church, as for legalistic righteousness, faultless. You see, in Paul's heart of hearts, he was defending the honor and integrity of God by persecuting the church. It's really easy to make these early chapters about Paul's life seem like he's an absolute villain. But he becomes a hero, and because of the zeal and the passion and the commitment to God that he carried, the very things that make us hate the character of Saul make us cheer for the character of Paul, because that zeal and passion and commitment are going to be transformed and redeemed for the kingdom. And that's when we see this switch, when Paul meets Jesus on the side of the road and goes on devoting the rest of his life to proclaiming the story of Jesus. Something interesting happens. Paul actually becomes a target of men like him, who are convinced of their own understanding of God and goodness, and they're intent on tearing Paul down. And that's what we see happen as we move forward in the book of Acts. We see Paul take to this missionary work of sharing the story of Jesus all over the place. And so he goes out, and as we see him go out, we see him hit by opposition over and over and over. So let's look at one of those stories today in Acts chapter 14. Here's what we read in Acts chapter 14. Paul and Barnabas went to the Jewish synagogue and preached with such power that a great number of both Jews and Greeks became believers. Some of the Jews, however, spurned God's message and poisoned the minds of the Gentiles against Paul and Barnabas. But the apostles stayed there a long time, preaching boldly about the grace of the Lord. And the Lord proved their message was true by giving them power to do miraculous signs and wonders. But the people of the town were divided in their opinion about them. Some of them sided with the Jews, and some with the apostles. Then a mob of Gentiles and Jews, along with their leaders, decided to attack and stone them. When the apostles learned of it, they fled to the region of Lycaonia, to the towns of Lystra and Derbe and the surrounding area, and there they preached the good news. So this is the pattern that we'll see from city to city as Paul goes about his missionary work for Jesus. There are people who are gripped by the story of Jesus, and there are people that absolutely want to rip it apart at the seams. And these accounts actually are going to become progressively more daunting. It starts as spreading rumors and mudslinging, and then there are public accusations and crooked trials and crooked courts, and eventually imprisonment and even torture. And this had to be deeply discouraging to Paul, because in Paul's way of thinking, it wasn't Jews versus Jesus. Jesus should be this uniting force as the Messiah to all nations, to bring God's love to all people. For Paul, who is deeply committed to his Jewish heritage and identity, and who's deeply committed to his newfound faith in Jesus, the internal conflict had to be devastating. He's feeling division from within the ranks. But it's not just the Jews who are opposed to the new story of Jesus. It's also the Gentiles, the Greeks and the Romans, who don't like the pushback that the new way of living the Jesus life brings against their pagan culture and society. And so they join in and they start throwing punches too. So really, the early church is experiencing this abuse from all sides. But it's not just trouble and tension from outside sources that are threatening the health of the early church. There's trouble from within as well. And so in the very next chapter of Acts, in Acts chapter 15, we're going to read this story about a conflict that's going to kind of carry throughout the rest of the book of Acts. And we actually read about it in multiple different letters that Paul wrote to the churches. What we're going to see is this central conflict, and we've heard it before, the debate around circumcision. And we're going to see, we see it kind of play out in the book of Acts. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But we also hear a different perspective in one of those letters. In the book of Galatians, Paul explains a little bit of the backstory about what we would read in the book of Acts. So at this point, Paul and Barnabas have been traveling across the ancient world now with the good news of Jesus, and they've been primarily focusing their ministry on the Gentile population. And Peter and the rest of the apostles have kind of made their way back to Jerusalem, and they're kind of overseeing the church movement at this point. And that's when something really interesting happens. That's when we see the start of this really kind of deep-seated conflict. And I'll read this to you from Galatians chapter 2. This is Paul speaking, and he says, "But when Peter came to Antioch, I had to oppose him to his face, for what he did was very wrong. When he first arrived, he ate with the Gentile believers who were not circumcised. But afterwards, when some friends of James came, Peter wouldn't eat with the Gentiles anymore. He was afraid of criticism from these people who insisted on the necessity of circumcision. As a result, other Jewish believers followed Peter's hypocrisy, and even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy." Paul is calling Peter out big time. And why? Well, he's calling Peter out because Peter is picking up the circumcision issue again when God had clearly told them all to drop it. If you remember, our friend Aaron talked about that just a few weeks ago. But Peter and many of the early apostles apparently were backpedaling on this newly established belief that the church could move ahead with a gospel free from the standard of circumcision. See, God had been speaking to the leaders of the church that the new way of Jesus wasn't bound up in this Old Testament established standard, that they could move forward with a gospel that was open to all people. Because let me tell you, that probably doesn't bode well for your new evangelical movement when you're like, hey, would you like to join our new faith in Jesus? By the way, you got to be circumcised first. I'm telling you, it didn't go over very well. But not just that. The circumcision issue was this issue that diametrically set Jews and Gentiles apart from each other and made the lines harsh and clear about who could and couldn't be part of God's people. But God was saying, hey, listen, this is why Jesus came. The teachings of Jesus and the death and resurrection of Jesus have made it clear that the gospel is available to all people. But there was still this debate. And so actually in Acts chapter 15, we read about the Jerusalem Council, where this meeting was held, where apostles and disciples came from all over the place to kind of like wrestle this issue to the ground. And I cannot imagine that it was an easy meeting, the Jerusalem Council. But eventually they came to agreement that the gospel of Jesus Christ was for all. And they sent letters to the churches to send them out so that people could stop holding these firm lines about who could and couldn't be part of this new Jesus movement. But you can sense as you read through this story that the debate hit hard and that tensions ran deep and that there was a lot of hurt along the way. But let me tell you, circumcision wasn't the only issue threatening the unity of the early church. There was just interpersonal, people drama happening too. In just a few chapters, Paul and Barnabas, who up to this point have been missionary partners, are going to have a disagreement so deep that it's going to split their ministry paths in two. So Barnabas wanted to take a guy named John Mark with him on their team, but Paul was strongly opposed because that guy named John Mark, I don't really know anything about him, but apparently he had deserted them in a previous missionary journey, and so Paul is like, nope. And it says that their disagreement was so sharp that they separated. So you guys, this is the picture of the early church. It feels a little bit like an unfiltered Instagram photo, doesn't it? Not all pretty and shiny and sparkly. This is the real stuff. It's a mess. We have gossip and rumors and infighting and backbiting and broken commitments and broken trust and broken partnerships, theological disputes, and all of this is just the stuff that's happening within the church. On top of that, you have opposition from Jewish leaders and from Greek and Roman authorities. It's a mess. And if you haven't noticed yet, so are we. The truth is that we are living through unprecedented disunity, both within the church and in the culture as a whole. It's been building for years, I think, this sense of, tribalism or polarization between partisan groups and even within the church. And none of this is really new, but I think in the last few years we've been feeling it a little bit more deeply. The lines have become harder and harsher. I don't think it's just me who's felt like that. It's become difficult to have an opinion about anything without finding yourself firmly defined by a hard-held line and kind of pigeonholed into one side or another. And the issues are diverse, right? You have conservatives versus liberals, or traditionalists versus progressives, or Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, or affirming versus non-affirming, anti-vax versus vaccinated, masking versus anti-masking. I have to tell you that my own personal podcast list has conversations about gender identity and sexual identity and LGBTQ equality and the prevalence of white Christian nationalism and militant masculinity and pushback against the purity culture and the commoditization of the evangelical movement and our propensity to elevate narcissistic leaders. I'm telling you, the conversations we're having right now about the depths of our disunity are disheartening. It's disheartening. And here's what's maybe so frustrating about the whole thing. You don't actually have to have an opinion or take a stance on these issues before being labeled or limited by these issues. You know what I mean? You can wear a mask or not wear a mask. And assumptions are made about who you are and what you believe. because of a piece of fabric that may or may not be on your face. You can so much as like a Facebook post, and you're instantly, apparently, obviously on one side or another. And I have to tell you, like, I didn't sign up for these teams. I don't know, was there a sign-in sheet and I accidentally wrote my name on it? Am I now like a certified this or that? I don't remember signing up for this. I don't even know how I got here. But the truth is, I think that we're living in these times that are so dangerously divided. And I think what's interesting is I think a lot of this polarization actually comes from our innate desire to be part of something. I don't think the issue is that we want to be opposed. I think it's that we want to be a part of something whole. But in that process, division sneaks in, and then you're on one side or someone's on the other, and it's just a whole big mess. And so we are living in these dangerously divided times. It's this post-truth era that we're a part of, where our capacity for controversy is really just like unlimited. It may be fueled by our accessibility to instant access internet that's made us addicts of information that's filtered by absolutely no one. And let me tell you, all of this that's stirring in our culture has taken a hit on our church, hasn't it? And it just keeps coming. I know people who have lost relationships in the last year and a half with family members or friends because of the political party that one or more of them might align with, or certain cultural beliefs that find themselves facing in other directions. And so when you intensify that with like the pandemic and this last election season, it's devastating. And maybe that describes you or someone that you know. Even here at the church, we've had small groups dissolve over opposing perspectives, or people leave the church because of a Facebook post or statements made in a singular sermon. And it's not just here at Northpoint, it's all over the country that the church has kind of taken this hit. And not just because of these diametrically opposed positions and perspectives, but maybe more importantly, the way we treat each other in the process. And people have seen it. The church has come off as bitter and uncaring and dogmatic and uncompassionate. The liberals are mean and the conservatives are arrogant. And what about those of us who just kind of want to live in the middle? Everyone is screaming at everyone, and why is everyone so loud, and why is everyone so mean? And guess what? People have noticed, and they've taken steps back. I am convinced that this year has cost the church more than anyone will ever know. I'm afraid that this year has cost the kingdom more than we will ever know. The number of people who've distanced themselves from the church because of the disunity they've seen in the church is likely staggering. And here's the truth. Some of us have wanted to leave. Some of us have questioned the faith system that we're a part of, the traditions that we have grown up in. Some of us have a growing frustration with leaders and long established structures. And I want to say this. If you're still following Jesus today, thank you. Thank you. The church has given you a handful of reasons, maybe 100 reasons to stop. But if you are still here, and not just at Northpoint, but if you are still following Jesus after the mess that we have been walking through, thank you. Thank you for placing the mission of the church and the hope of Jesus higher than hurt feelings or bruised egos. Thank you for conviction, despite all of the reasons that you could have stepped away, because we are splintered, the church. We feel fractured, but we can heal, and we can heal together. A pastor friend of mine shared this on their Facebook page this week. I'm going to put it up on the screen for you guys to read. It says, "We are wounded in community and we are healed in community. No way around it." And that is the truth. We are wounded in community, but we are healed in community. So the question that we have to ask today is, how do those of us still in the church respond to the disunity we see in the church? How does a fractured church heal and move forward? I want to pick out a few points from our passage today that I think are going to point us in that right direction. So here's the first. Remember the motivation, right? We talked about this when we talked about the story of Paul. We read about him, right? How he was present at the stoning of Peter and thinking maybe in his own heart that he was wholeheartedly honoring and protecting the glory of God. He thought that he was on the right side of the issue, and you can call him wrong, or you can call him ignorant. You can even call him evil if you want, but there was, I think, something noble in his intent, right? Listen, the people that you are opposed to are not the evil that we are fighting, not in this place, not in the church. It's not this issue versus this issue and that issue versus that issue. It's really unity versus disunity. It's this commitment to each other, or laying that commitment down and walking away from this goal that Jesus set for us to be a people united by his Spirit and by his love. So what we would do well to remember is that those folks who might have different opinions or perspectives have in their core this motivation likely to see the kingdom come in the same way that you do, just in a different way. And that's when we see the next point when it comes to this conversation about unity, is that unity actually requires diversity. Unity requires diversity. That's another thing that we see in this text today. When we see these disagreements that lead to disconnection, guess what? The gospel goes with both parties. When Peter and Paul don't agree, they wrestle it out, but the gospel moved on. When Paul and Barnabas had different opinions, they parted ways, but the gospel went with both of them. This makes it clear to me that unity is not uniformity. Unity is not uniformity. And here's the truth. The opinions and perspectives that we bring to the table, the different causes we choose to champion and care for, this is how we cover ground in the kingdom movement, you guys. And it's how we sharpen each other as we challenge each other with these different perspectives, sharing them but not forcing them on each other, as we embrace and celebrate our diversity as a group of people with different experiences and perspectives and opinions. Guess what? We get to share with more people outside of those places because we've all brought those things into the same place. I think one of the sad things that I've seen as a church leader through this last pandemic year is this polarization of the churches. So as we've walked through this, we've talked about how easy it is to feel like you're being labeled on one side or the other. And the same things happened in a lot of our churches. You know, if we did the mask thing during the pandemic, then those people who didn't want to find masks might have went to another church where they didn't have to wear them. Or similarly, if you were doing the mask, or you weren't doing the mask thing at one church, then you might leave and go to a church where they do have masks. And guess what happened? Some sad sifting, I think. happened in that process, where we all kind of find ourselves like huddled together with people who look maybe a little bit more like us than we all did pre-pandemic. And maybe that's fine, but maybe it's not. One of my favorite things about our church has always been that we have people from all different kinds of walks of life, people who sit in different positions and carry different opinions, and we choose to, usually, love each other well despite. And maybe, like, in part because we are all so different. You guys, unity requires diversity. There is no peace with forced compliance. There's not. We need each other, and we need each other's stories and perspectives. It's how we sharpen each other and create a rich and vibrant community. Unity requires diversity. And the last thing is that unity requires you. It requires you. There's this prayer that's recorded in the book of John. We read about Jesus praying often throughout the scriptures, but we have this like rare record of Jesus's actual words of the things that he prayed for his people on the night before he was sent to the cross. It's in John 17, and he's praying for you and for me. And here's what Jesus says in John 17. He says, I am praying not only for these disciples, but also for all who will ever believe in me through their message. I pray that they will be one, just as you and I are one, as you are in me, Father, and I am in you. And may they be in us so that the world will believe you sent me. I have given them the glory you gave me, so that they may be one as we are one. I am in them, and you are in me. May they experience such perfect unity that the world will know that you sent me and that you loved them as much as you love me. So we can read that passage and feel discouraged because we don't see that kind of unity in the church that we see, or in America at all. We can read that and think, oh man, why are we so far from the goal that Jesus set for us to be one and to experience such perfect unity that all people could know who he is? You can hear this and you can be discouraged, or you can hear this and be encouraged, because this is Jesus' prayer. And guess what? It hasn't been answered yet. Maybe you have a prayer that you feel like God maybe should have answered by now. If any prayer ought to have an answer from God or ought to have come to like fulfillment at this point, don't you think it's Jesus's prayer for his people from 2,000 years ago? But guess what? He hasn't answered it yet. God is still working on it. Or maybe God is still working on us. Listen, if God can use the busted up church from 2,000 years ago to change the world with all of its dysfunction and dissension, don't you think he can use what we've got now? He's working on it because he's still working on us. So as long as we continue to faithfully show up in the name of Jesus, I have hope for the church. I have so much hope for the church. So 2 things I want to leave with you before we close out today. 2 things that you can do to help the dysfunctional church heal. 2 things. Look for a way that you can really be the church. You. How can you be the church? How can you serve? Where can you lead? How can you be a place of refuge for people who are hurting? How can you bring encouragement to people who are discouraged? How can you give the hope of Jesus to others? This is the goal of the church. How can you be the church? And next, how can you be a friend? How can you be a friend? Who can you be a friend to? You guys, this picture of the church like the beautiful picture of the church walking in unity, only comes when people live out real life relationships with others with compassion and empathy and caring and generosity and accountability and so much love. And it's built relationship by relationship, friendship by friendship along the way. A few weeks ago, I went to a lunch meeting with a bunch of local vineyard pastors, and we were actually visited by our new national director, who's named Jay Pathak. Jay is a pastor out in the Denver area, and he leads this really dynamic church that's actually 6 churches, and so many people in their community have come to Jesus because of this mindset that they carry as a church, and that's that they're a church that's built through relationships and friendships. And so the challenge that he gave us was, what if you found some friends and invested in those relationships well? And what if those friends also had friends and they invested in relationships and shared the hope of Jesus as well? And then what if those friends invested in some new friends and made some new friends and shared the hope of Jesus along the way? And together, like that's what the church is. That's what the church is. So how can you be a friend, and who can you be a friend to? I have so much hope for the church because you're still here. Thank you for being part of our church. Thank you for your commitment to the church. And thank you for joining us on this journey towards unity. I'm going to leave you guys with a few questions that you can process through this week as you consider your role in this picture. First, how have you experienced disunity in the church? How have you experienced disunity in the church personally? What damage has it done in your life or someone else's? And here's a harder question. Did you help cause it? Just asking. How have you experienced disunity in the church? And then next, how can you be the church? And how can you be a friend? Friends, thank you for watching with us today, and I am praying for you this week as you wrestle with your role in the church and ask God to give you insight about how you can hand the hope of Jesus to people you come in contact with. Praying for you this week. We love you guys very much, and we'll see you soon. Bye.